"This is beneath us," Sergeant Xylo muttered, leaning against the bulkhead, his four-fingered hand lazily spinning a plasma knife. "Hunting a human? We conquered this rock 2 decades ago. If there's anything left, it's just rodents and their relics." Barax remained still, his gaze locked onto the image in the hologram, a grainy, distorted shot of a human woman, mid-stride in what appeared to be a dense forest. Her face was partially obscured by motion blur, but the dossier claimed she was Lena Volkova, a former general in Earth's last resistance movement. An old soldier hiding in the trees. Scout Karish scoffed, clicking her mandibles in irritation. "I've taken down entire armored battalions. You want me to track a single flesh being who probably forgot how to hold a weapon?" Barax's upper lip curled, an approximation of a sneer. He'd had enough of their arrogance. Ryturian elites had a tendency to overestimate themselves, and he despised their smugness, even as he indulged in it himself. "You think this is simple? You think High Command sends Omega Prime on missions for amusement?" His voice was low, sharp, a serrated blade cutting through the squad's cockiness. "This is not a hunt. This is an extermination order. That woman down there is a remnant of a dead species. If she is still alive, it is because she is dangerous." Xylo huffed but remained silent. Karish shifted her stance, uneasy now. Barax tapped the hologram, enlarging a classified file. "Her name is Lena Volkova. Humans have a name for her. Baba Yaga." A ripple of discomfort passed through the squad. Karish flicked her forked tongue out in thought. The name wasn't new. It had circulated through military channels for years, whispered in barracks and war rooms like some ancient Earth curse. The problem was, it wasn't a myth. Ryturian soldiers stationed on Earth's surface during the occupation had spoken of an unstoppable force. A ghost in the woods. A woman who could slaughter an entire platoon and leave no trace but the scent of blood and gunpowder. Many assumed it was human propaganda. Resistance, morale-boosting nonsense. Barax knew better. "This file is sealed," Technician Varen murmured, his elongated fingers flying over his interface. Accessing it required direct authorization from High Command. "Then perhaps you should ask yourself why High Command sent us to kill a harmless old woman." Barax let the words settle. Silence filled the command chamber. Varen swallowed. "There's a report here. From the Battle of Sector 12. Ryturian forces engaged a small human resistance group led by Volkova. They expected an easy victory. They were wrong." Barax's voice carried none of the amusement the others had before. She reduced an entire armored division to scrap metal and charred bones. "We lost 400 soldiers that day. The survivors were broken." Karish's tail twitched, her confidence flickering. "But that was years ago. A human can't live alone in the wild that long. She's either dead or so weak she won't be a threat." Xylo, always the skeptic, scoffed. "And what's she been doing? Farming? Weeding her little Terran garden? Collecting bones to make necklaces?" He chuckled. Barax deactivated the hologram with a flick of his wrist. "You'll see soon enough." The drop pod hit the Earth's atmosphere like a meteor, fire streaking across the sky as it plummeted into the darkened forest below. The Ryturian squad was silent as they descended, even Xylo for once suppressing his usual snide remarks. Their armor's internal systems dampened the turbulence, but nothing could prepare them for the impact of landing. The pod smashed into the earth with a deafening boom, scattering debris and sending up a plume of dirt and smoke. The doors hissed open, and the squad stepped out into the cold night air. The forest loomed around them, ancient and unwelcoming. Towering trees twisted toward the sky, their branches clawing at the moon. A heavy mist curled through the underbrush, wrapping around their feet like spectral fingers. The only sounds were the distant hoots of unseen creatures and the rhythmic creaking of branches swaying in the wind. "This place reeks of decay," Karish muttered, her slitted pupils narrowing. Varen adjusted his scanner. "I'm detecting nothing." He frowned, recalibrating. "No movement. No wildlife within 100 meters. That's wrong." Karish's instincts flared. Forests were never silent. Not unless something had silenced them. Xylo kicked a fallen log aside. Maybe your fancy tech's just broken. Ever think about that? Or, Varen countered, something is interfering. Barax motioned for silence. We move. Spread formation. No mistakes. The squad fanned out, weapons raised, moving cautiously through the dense undergrowth. Every footstep felt too loud, too intrusive. Their armor's advanced sensory tech should have mapped the terrain instantly, detected any heat signatures, pinpointed any threats. But nothing was showing up. Then the first trap was triggered. Xylo was the first to go down. It was fast, too fast. One moment he was stepping forward, the next something snapped from the underbrush, yanking him upside down with a sickening crack. His weapon clattered to the ground. He dangled there, struggling, as the squad spun toward the source. What the? A rope trap. A primitive, human rope trap. Barax cursed under his breath. This wasn't possible. Ryterian energy shields could deflect plasma bolts. They could endure explosions. But they had no defense against rope. Cut him down, he barked. Karish leapt forward, her claws slicing through the rope, dropping Xylo unceremoniously to the ground. He groaned, rubbing his head. What kind of caveman-level crap? Another trap triggered. A net, woven from something suspiciously durable, yanked Varen off his feet and sent him hurtling into a tree. He let out a garbled curse. Barax was already moving, his combat blade slicing through the netting, freeing the technician. This isn't random, Varen wheezed, struggling to stand. These are setups. Karish's muscles tensed. We're being herded. Then the laughter started. Soft at first. A rasping chuckle, drifting on the wind. It wasn't close. But it wasn't far enough. Xylo grabbed his plasma rifle, aiming wildly. What the hell was that? More laughter. This time from a different direction. Karish's frill stiffened. She's watching us. Barax's blood turned cold. He activated his helmet's enhanced optics, scanning the treetops, the shadows, anything that could give away their stalker. Nothing. No heat signature. No movement. Just the laughter. A human laugh. Not a young one. Not the laugh of a reckless soldier or a mad scavenger. It was seasoned. Old. Amused. Mocking. Then the whisper came. Little aliens think they're hunters. The squad froze. The voice had no clear direction. It seeped through the air like a ghost's murmur. Welcome to my woods. Barax raised his rifle. Formation. Now. But it was already too late. The first body hit the ground before the others could react. Karish barely had time to turn before something slammed into her. A blur of motion, a flash of steel. Xylo screamed. He opened fire, plasma bolts slicing through the trees. But they hit nothing. Varen fumbled with his comms, desperately trying to call for backup. There was only static. Barax gritted his teeth, stepping forward, raising his rifle. His voice was calm, measured. Volkova. The forest was silent again. Then, right behind him, inches from his ear, the voice whispered. Boo. The rifle was torn from his hands. The last thing Barax saw before darkness took him was a flash of steel and the knowing grin of Baba Yaga herself. Lena Volkova sat on the porch of her cabin, a chipped enamel mug of whiskey in her hand, watching the sunrise filter through the misty treetops. The air was crisp, thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, and somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf let out a mournful howl. She exhaled slowly, savoring the silence, the peace she had carved out in these woods for the last 20 years. It hadn't been easy. Solitude was never easy. But solitude was safe. She was no longer General Lena Volkova of the Earth Resistance, the name that had once sent Ryterian warlords into hushed conversations and urgent strategy meetings. She wasn't even Baba Yaga, the whispered legend among alien troops, the unseen force that turned elite squads into shredded meat in the dark. She was just an old woman with a bad knee, a stubborn streak, and a profound appreciation for a well-aged bottle of bourbon. But peace was a fragile thing, and she had learned long ago that it never lasted. Her ears caught it first, an unnatural hum in the distance, just beneath the morning birdsong. A low, thrumming vibration, pulsing through the air like a machine forcing itself into a world that did not want it. Her grip tightened on the mug. Ryterians. They were here. She leaned back, exhaling through her nose, slow and measured, letting the warmth of the whiskey settle in her stomach. She'd known this day would come. She had buried herself in these woods, but she had never been foolish enough to believe she was forgotten. Setting the mug down, she stretched her arms above her head, rolling her shoulders. She was getting too old for this. Her body reminded her of that every damn morning when her bones protested against the cold. But some habits never died, and war was one of them. She slipped inside the cabin, running her fingers along the wooden walls, feeling the worn grain beneath her calloused hands. Her arsenal was hidden in plain sight, disguised among the mundane clutter of an old hermit's life. A stack of firewood concealed a cache of modified weapons. A loose floorboard held an old combat knife that had seen more blood than she cared to remember. She lifted a rusted oil lantern from a shelf, twisted its base, and the false bottom slid open, revealing the gleaming black metal of a pulse rifle. Lena grunted. A pulse rifle was a young woman's weapon. She set it aside, reaching instead for a sawed-off shotgun. Simple, brutal, reliable. Outside, the forest had gone silent. That was always the first sign. She stepped onto the porch, rolling her neck as she looked toward the trees. Her gut told her they were close now, but they weren't rushing in. No, they were moving carefully, systematically. She could almost admire that. The dumb ones charged in blind and got themselves killed fast. These ones were patient, smart. She liked that. The first one she spotted was perched in the trees, almost invisible against the branches, his bio-armor shifting colors like a chameleon. She wouldn't have noticed him at all if not for the shimmer of his optical field glitching ever so slightly. She smirked. Ryterian tech always worked beautifully in controlled conditions, but drop them in the real world, rain, dirt, humidity, and they were just as unreliable as the idiots who built them. The second one was crouched low in the underbrush, scanning the perimeter with a sleek, angular weapon bristling with attachments. Lena had seen enough of them before to know it was over-designed. Too many buttons, too many functions. A weapon like that made a soldier overconfident, too reliant on its features. She bet he'd never fired an unsighted bullet in his life. The third was moving closer to her cabin, trying to keep to the shadows, but there was a hesitation in his steps, a caution that told her they had already realized something was wrong. Good. She slipped down from the porch without a sound, moving with a practiced ease that belied her age. The key to hunting was patience, and she had spent years turning patience into an art form. The first kill was clean, quick. A simple length of wire looped low across a game trail. The Ryterian in the underbrush didn't even have time to react before he was jerked backward, feet flying out from under him as the wire snapped taut around his throat. He gurgled, struggling, claws grasping at his armor, but the pressure was already crushing his windpipe. Lena let him go still before stepping forward, retrieving her wire with a methodical tug. She checked his weapon, rolling her eyes at its impracticality before tossing it aside. The second one almost spotted her. Almost. He was scanning the trees, tense, clearly unnerved. She let a twig snap under her boot, deliberately. The moment he turned toward the sound, she fired. A single shotgun blast. The force slammed him backward, sending him crashing through the underbrush. His body convulsed once, then stilled. 2 down. The third one had realized what was happening. She heard him speaking rapidly into his communicator, probably trying to alert his team. She moved fast, cutting the distance between them as he fumbled with his weapon. He saw her too late. She was already on him, her knife flashing in the dim morning light. His armor was advanced, but there were always weak points. Joints. The spaces between plates. She drove the blade up beneath his jaw, twisting. His body jerked, then went slack. 3. She exhaled, stepping back. They would notice soon. She wiped her blade on the dead soldier's armor, taking a moment to listen. The forest was still silent, but she knew better than to let that comfort her. The others would regroup. They wouldn't make the same mistakes. That was fine. She had plenty more surprises for them. She moved swiftly, resetting a few traps, rigging an old pressure plate she had been saving for emergencies. She had scavenged it from a downed Ryterian drone years ago, repurposed it into something more analog, less reliant on faulty alien circuitry. The key was simplicity. She could almost hear her old commander's voice in her head. High-tech weapons make soldiers lazy. Trust steel. Trust your hands. She hadn't listened back then. Not fully. She listened now. It was almost an hour before the rest of them came. She heard them first, moving more cautiously, more deliberately. They had found the bodies. They were talking, their voices clipped, tense. They weren't so smug anymore. She smiled to herself. The first one hit the pressure plate. The explosion was small, controlled, just enough to send him flying. His armor absorbed most of it, but the concussive force knocked the fight out of him. He groaned, struggling to move. Lena didn't give him the chance. A quick stomp to the throat, a sharp, sickening crunch. 4. The others panicked. She moved like a shadow, taking advantage of their fear. One ran. She let him. She wasn't worried about him escaping. The only way out was through her woods, and these woods belonged to her. The last one tried to fight. Tried. She disarmed him in 2 moves, snapping his arm back at an unnatural angle. His scream was short-lived. A well-placed strike to the temple silenced him. She stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, letting the adrenaline settle. The bodies lay around her, some still twitching, the air thick with a metallic scent of blood and ozone. It was done. For now. She knelt beside the one who had run, gripping his helmet, tilting his head up to meet her gaze. His mandibles quivered. "Run back to your masters," she murmured, voice calm. "Tell them what happened here." His eyes darted, uncertain. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. "Tell them Baba Yaga is still alive." She let him go. He didn't hesitate. He ran. Lena watched him disappear into the trees, then turned back toward her cabin. She was getting too old for this. She picked up her shotgun, slinging it over her shoulder. They would come back. They always did. But that was fine. She would be waiting. Varen stumbled through the underbrush, lungs burning, vision swimming as his body fought to keep up with the terror pulsing through his veins. He wasn't trained for this. None of them were. The Ryterian elite forces had been forged in battle, yes, but not this kind of battle. They had conquered planets, decimated resistance cells, and crushed primitive civilizations with fire and steel. But this was different. This was something out of a nightmare. The mission had been routine, an extermination order, nothing more. A final sweep of a forgotten backwater to eliminate a single human remnant. But now, as he scrambled forward, pulse hammering in his ears, he realized the truth. They weren't the hunters. They were the prey. The woman, the one they had called Baba Yaga, had turned their advanced tactics into a game of survival horror. Their weapons, their technology useless. Their training, their precision, irrelevant. She had torn through their ranks like a force of nature, using the terrain, the shadows, and the very air itself as her allies. Varen's comms unit crackled with static as he tried to raise Commander Barax. His breath came out in ragged gasps. "Commander," he choked, pausing to lean against a tree, his 3-fingered hand gripping his wounded shoulder. She took out Karish. Xylo, most of the squad is... A rustling sound. He spun, weapon raised. Nothing. Just the wind. But that was the problem, wasn't it? Nothing meant everything in these woods. Nothing meant she was near. His breath came out in short, panic bursts as he forced himself forward. He had to reach Barax. Had to warn him. Not that he needed to. Barax already knew. The commander stood at the edge of a clearing, rifle at his side, eyes cold as he scanned the treetops. The bodies of 2 more soldiers lay motionless behind him, their forms barely visible in the thickening fog. "She's playing with us," he said, his voice low, controlled. "Flushing us out. Making us run." Varen swallowed hard. "We have to call for evac." "There is no evac." Barax turned to face him fully. His armor was scratched, dirted. The gleaming pride of Ryterian war tech dulled by the reality of a fight he hadn't expected. She jammed our comms the moment we landed. Varen's stomach dropped. Then what do we do? We stop running. The words were firm, unwavering. Varen's mouth opened, then closed. His training told him to obey. His instincts told him to keep running. The silence stretched between them. Then, the laughter came again. Soft. Whispered. A sound that did not belong to the living. Yet here it was, mocking, taunting, wrapping around them like an unseen noose. Barax's grip tightened around his rifle. His mandibles flexed. Show yourself, Volkova. The trees did not answer. The fog thickened. And then, with no warning, a body crashed into the clearing, hitting the ground with a wet, sickening thud. Varen flinched, stepping back as the corpse of Sergeant Xylo sprawled across the dirt. His helmet was gone. His throat, his entire throat, had been torn open, the wound too jagged for a clean blade, too controlled for an animal attack. Something had done this slowly. Varen gagged, bile rising in his throat. Barax didn't move. His expression did not change. Then, above them, a voice, close this time, closer than ever before. You came all this way, Lena mused, her tone almost amused. And for what? To die in my woods. Varen whirled, weapon raised, scanning the fog, the branches, the shadows. But he saw nothing. You should have stayed in the sky, she continued, her voice shifting locations, as if she were circling them unseen. Ryturians always think war is about who has the biggest guns. A pause. A whisper. That's why you lose. Barax didn't hesitate. He fired into the trees, a rapid burst of plasma, rounds streaking into the darkness. Nothing. Not even a rustle. The moment his weapon stopped, a whirring sound filled the air, a metallic click-click-click, fast and rhythmic. Varen's eyes darted toward the source. His gut turned to ice. Grenades. Dozens of them. Not high-tech, Ryturian explosives. No plasma-based detonation system. No sleek, ergonomic design. No. These were human-made, rusty, old, and wired to a trip mechanism. Down, Barax barked, but it was already too late. The first explosion sent shock waves through the clearing, blinding white light illuminating the fog for half a second before the air itself seemed to shatter. Trees splintered. Dirt and shrapnel flew. Varen felt himself lifted, thrown by the force, pain lancing through his ribs as he slammed into something hard. His vision blurred. His head rang. Somewhere in the chaos, he heard screaming. And through the smoke, through the fire, she came. Lena moved like a phantom, weaving through the wreckage. A blur of motion that shouldn't have belonged to a woman her age. Her shotgun was already raised. The first blast caught Scout Karish, tearing through her armor as if it were paper. She went down hard, a guttural, choking sound escaping her as she collapsed. Varen's heart pounded. His vision swam. He scrambled for his weapon. Lena saw. She moved. Before he could react, she was on him. A boot slammed down onto his chest, pinning him to the ground. The air rushed from his lungs. She stared down at him, face shadowed, the cold glint of her eyes visible even through the smoke. Shoo, she murmured. Then she twisted, a sharp, precise movement, and the butt of her shotgun slammed into his face. Blackness. When Varen woke, the world was wrong. His body ached. His head pounded. And the first thing he saw was Barax, still alive, but restrained, bound, trapped. Lena stood a few feet away, her back turned, pouring something from a dented canister into an old metal cup. Coffee. She was making coffee. Varen blinked. His mind struggled to process. Barax was awake too, watching her with the cold calculation of a soldier who had lost but refused to accept it. She turned then, taking a slow sip, eyes locking onto Barax. You should have left me alone. Barax didn't respond. Lena sighed, setting the cup down on a nearby crate. I let one of you go, she continued, stepping closer. You know what that means, don't you? Barax's mandibles tightened. High Command knows, she said. They'll send more, and more, and more. She crouched in front of him, voice dropping. That's what you Ryturians do, isn't it? You never learn. You just send more. Varen shuddered. His ribs ached. His mouth tasted like blood. Lena reached forward, grasping the front of Barax's armor. And then she leaned in. "You tell them," she whispered. "You tell them what happened here." Her grip tightened. Her next words were like steel. "You tell them Baba Yaga is still here." Barax didn't blink, didn't move. Lena released him, standing, rolling her shoulders as she walked back toward her coffee. There was silence. Varen's breath was unsteady. Then Barax spoke. Low, measured. "You think this ends here?" Lena smiled, lifting her cup. "Oh, I know it doesn't." She took a sip. Barax stared at her. Then, without another word, Lena turned, walking toward the tree-line. And just like that, she was gone. The woods swallowed her. Varen let out a slow, shuddering breath. Barax clenched his jaw. There was no point in fighting now. Not against her. Not against Baba Yaga. Not today. The Ryturian High Command did not speak for a long time. The chamber was dim, lit only by the flickering holographic display hovering above the Grand War table. Rows of alien officials sat rigid, their expressions unreadable. The air was thick with tension, a heavy silence stretching between them as they reviewed the footage extracted from technician Varen's shattered helmicam. The playback was fragmented, distorted by static and the chaotic remnants of battle, but the message was clear. Their elite strike force was gone, erased, decimated, by a single human, by her. The silence broke when High Strategist Karash exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair, mandibles clicking in agitation. "One woman," he muttered, almost disbelieving. "One human." Across the table, Lord Marshal Xythun spoke without looking up. "She let them live." His voice was low, thoughtful. The others turned toward him. Karash frowned. "What?" "She let them live," Xythun repeated, tapping a clawed finger against the table. "Commander Barax. Technician Varen. She had them. Could have flayed them, left them as a warning. But she didn't. She sent a different warning," one of the junior tacticians murmured. They all knew what it meant. It wasn't just a message to High Command. It was a challenge. A slow ripple of unease spread across the war table. Finally, Grand Arbiter Kalos, one of the oldest and most feared minds in the Ryturian Empire, spoke. "We increased the bounty." The command was immediate, absolute. A murmur spread through the ranks, a few officials nodding, others shifting uncomfortably. 10 million credits, Karash suggested. "Not enough," Kalos said. His sunken eyes gleamed with cold intent. "Triple it." 30 million? One of the generals scoffed. "That's the price of an entire fleet." "Then let an entire fleet try," Kalos murmured. Across the chamber, Xythun folded his hands, exhaling slowly. They all knew the truth. Even with a 30 million credit bounty, few would take the job. No Ryturian mercenary wanted to hunt Baba Yaga. Because the stories weren't just stories anymore. They were warnings. Far from the cold steel of the Ryturian war rooms, deep in the heart of the forgotten wilderness, Lena Volkova sat in her cabin, watching the flames of her wood-burning stove flicker and dance. She had seen many fires in her life, some kind, some cruel. This one she liked. It was simple, warm, real. Her hands, still scarred from a lifetime of war, curled around a tin mug of strong coffee. She took a slow sip, letting the heat roll across her tongue. The whiskey was still on the shelf. She hadn't touched it since the last fight. There was something about war that dulled the taste of alcohol. Or maybe it was just the ghosts. She leaned back in her chair, stretching her legs, listening to the soft creak of the wood beneath her. The scars on her body ached in the cold, old wounds whispering their presence, but she paid them no mind. The woods were quiet again. For now. A knock at the door. Not heavy, not urgent, deliberate. Lena exhaled, setting the mug down. Her fingers found the shotgun leaning against the table. She didn't stand immediately, didn't speak, just listened. A pause, then a voice. Not Ryturian, not a soldier. "Open up, Baba Yaga." Lena sighed through her nose. The voice was human, and she hadn't heard another human voice in a long, long time. She pushed herself to her feet, her movements slow but certain, the shotgun still resting in her grip as she approached the door. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing against her, something old stirring in her chest. She unlocked the door, pulled it open, and stared. The man on the other side wasn't young. His face was lined with age, his hair touched with silver, but his eyes held the sharp glint of someone who had seen too much, survived too much. She knew that look. She had lived that look. Lena's jaw tightened. "You're supposed to be dead." The man smirked, shifting his weight. "Funny. I was about to say the same about you." Lena studied him, her grip still firm on the shotgun. "Who sent you?" "No one." His smirk faded slightly. "Not anymore." She didn't move, didn't blink. Then, slowly, she stepped aside. The man entered without hesitation, moving toward the small wooden table near the fire. He lowered himself into the chair opposite hers, stretching out his hands as if to warm them. Lena closed the door, locking it once more. She turned, arms crossing over her chest. "Start talking." The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced around, taking in the simple cabin, the battered weapons along the wall, the neat stack of books in the corner. Finally, his gaze met hers. "You know they won't stop coming," he said. Lena's lips pressed into a thin line. "They'll keep sending soldiers," he continued. "Stronger ones. Smarter ones." "I know," she said. "And when that doesn't work, they'll escalate. Ships. Firebombing. Maybe even another purge." "I know." The fire crackled between them. The man leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "So what's the plan, General?" She flinched. It was barely noticeable. But he noticed, because he still called her General. Not Baba Yaga. Not Ghost. Not Boogeyman. General. Lena exhaled, dragging a hand through her graying hair. "There is no plan." The man raised an eyebrow. "That doesn't sound like you." She scoffed. "You don't know me anymore." "I know enough," he said. "Enough to know you don't want to die here, alone in the woods, waiting for them to burn you out." Lena didn't answer. Didn't want to answer. The man leaned back, letting the silence sit between them for a moment before speaking again. "There's a group," he said. Lena stiffened. "They call themselves the Remnants," he continued. "Scattered resistance fighters. Exiles. Humans who escaped the purge. Some ex-slaves from Ryturian colonies. Some old soldiers." Lena's eyes darkened. "Soldiers are dead." "Not all of them." A beat. A pause. A whisper of something old, something heavy settling in her chest. The man exhaled. "They need a leader." Lena scoffed. "They need a miracle." His lips quirked. "Same thing." The fire crackled. The wind howled outside. Lena ran a thumb along the barrel of her shotgun, staring at the embers in the fireplace. She could stay here. She could. She could let the war pass her by. Let the Ryturians keep sending their hunters. Let the legends grow. Let the Empire waste its time chasing a ghost in the woods. She could keep drinking whiskey and coffee and pretending she didn't still want to fight. Or she could finish this. Her fingers tightened around the wood grain of the shotgun. The man across from her smiled. A slow, knowing smile. Lena sighed, shaking her head. "Fine," she muttered. The man grinned. "Thought so." Lena exhaled, reached for her coffee, and took a long, slow sip. "Hope they've got good coffee," she muttered. "Better than this swill," the man quipped. Lena smirked. Then, without another word, she stood, stepping toward the door. The hunt wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And if the Ryturian Empire wanted to keep playing this game, then it was time to remind them exactly why humans were the last species in the galaxy they should have ever underestimated. Baba Yaga was going back to war,